Okay, we want to briefly look at interpretation of slopes, areas, and accumulated areas. Say that interpretation can be indicated by or depends on solely the interpretation of a single trapezoid. So, examples we've seen, if you have speed versus clock time, then the slope of an individual trapezoid represents the average rate of change of speed with respect to clock time, and the area of an individual trapezoid represents the approximate distance covered on the corresponding interval of the horizontal axis. Accumulated area represents then the total distance covered through the end of the subinterval. So the accumulated area through the end of the second subinterval is equal to the area of the first plus the area of the second. So whatever quantity is represented by area, in this case distance covered, we get the accumulated area equal to the total distance covered up through the end of that interval, up through the time that's represented by x2. Okay, salary, pay rate versus clock time. Slopes represent the average rate of change of salary with respect to clock time, or average rate of change of pay rate with respect to clock time. Again, as we saw, you can review that. And the area of a trapezoid represents the approximate earnings over the associated interval. The accumulated area, therefore, represents total earning through the end of whatever subinterval. So if we go through the end of this subinterval, the accumulated area we have here is the sum of all the areas of all the intervals up through this one, and it represents how much we've been paid up through this point. Other examples, value of an investment versus clock time. What do slopes represent? What do areas represent? Slopes represent rates of change of the investment with respect to clock time. How quickly is your investment changing at a given time or on the average on a given interval? And the area has no significant interpretation, as we've seen. So accumulated area, it makes no sense to talk about accumulated area if area doesn't have a significant interpretation. We calculate the areas, but it doesn't have any meaning, or at least any meaning that's relevant to anything that we want to think about. Okay, force versus position, as we've seen, of course, the slopes represent average rate of change of force with respect to position. At what rate does force change as we move a little bit? And areas turn out to represent work or energy expended. The area of a trapezoid is the work or energy expended on that trapezoid. So that the accumulated area in this case would represent the total amount of work done or energy expended from whatever point is represented by x naught equal to a up through whatever point is represented by the end of the trapezoid we're talking about. And then position versus clock time. The rate of change of the position with respect to clock time is how quickly position is changing. The rate at which position is changing, that would be velocity. And areas would have no significant interpretation, so neither would accumulated areas. So when we look at the overall graph, the overall trapezoidal graph, we have a series of slopes. Each slope is an average of the slopes over the total subinterval. In the case of this interval, the straight line stays pretty close to the graph, and the slopes of the graph are pretty close to the slopes of the straight line, so that this slope would represent pretty much any slope in here. In this case, though, the slope at the beginning of the interval is much greater than the slope at the end, so that the single slope that we get from the average doesn't do a really good job of representing all the slopes in this interval. The slope segments, the approximating segments, stay pretty close to the graph, so our areas and our accumulated areas will be pretty close to the actual areas and accumulated areas underneath the graph. And of course, we'll discuss that at greater length.